Here we go. We are back with Persuasion. This may be a shorter sequence. I hadn't realized how much shorter Persuasion was
Yes.
than the other novels. A couple things I hadn't realized about Persuasion that I'm sure we'll get to here at some point or another. I've got a few notes for things that I think stood out. I'm sure there's some stuff I didn't catch or that I didn't understand as much as I thought I did, maybe. But there's a lot going on.
First time reading it for me.
Well, I was just going to say, this is certainly my first time reading it, but I was struck by the sudden reminiscence just before we finished today's reading. I must have watched a movie version of this at some point because I have a definite memory of that scene on the Cobb where Louisa has her accident, and so I suspect I know more about this story than I thought I did. I have this sort of faint memory of something. It must have been years and years ago that I saw. But that sequence where she jumps off the stairs is something I've definitely seen in a movie.
Yeah.
So I was kind of intrigued to sort of read 90 pages of this feeling like I didn't know the story, and then suddenly, go, wait a second.
I remember that.
Yeah. But yeah, so first reading, a very different feeling book, I'm going to begin by saying. But tell me what you're thinking so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's no less ruled by concerns of money and property than other novels. I mean, in fact, our interest in the business of the entail from Sense and Sensibility seems like this is what has come back again with Mr. Elliot not having a male heir, that the property is going to be transferred to Anne and Elizabeth and Mary's cousin, who they run into very briefly in that same sequence where Louisa gets hurt, by the way.
Right.
Seems like maybe we're being set up to think this guy's not as much of a schmuck as the entail guy in Sense and Sensibility was, especially since, unlike Emma, much to our frustration, at Mr. Woodhouse, we felt like if he's the villain of the novel, like that one guy argued, it's still just super subtle. And in the end, we thought maybe the narrator was just kind of gentle with him. Not so with Anne's father. Right. I mean, he's just a pompous, preening, pretty boy, I guess.
Well, yeah.
So it could be that this falling out with the entail dude is the right thing according to the moral universe.
Yeah, although we don't know a whole lot about. We know that there was an encounter with him at some point, and it didn't go the way that Elizabeth wanted.
Elizabeth thought she was going to marry him or something.
Right. But I don't know that I read into it that he was a jerk as much as he just sort of wasn't into her.
Yeah.
And so that's going
to... neither are we.
Right. Well, I'm intrigued. One of the things that...
By Elizabeth?
Yeah, well, one of the things that stands out to me kind of early on in my reading here, I mean, I was definitely thinking about this by about page 10.
Yeah.
I felt very much, and maybe it's just that the name Elizabeth, because of how much I like Sense and Sensibility,
or Pride and Prejudice with Elizabeth Bennet,
because of how much I liked that story,
yeah.
I was 100% prepared for a story about Elizabeth Elliot.
Right.
And then, 15, 20 pages in, she's gone. And
for now, I mean, we're by the way, what did we read the first half? Yeah, we finished chapter 13.
Yeah, we're halfway.
She and the father have removed to Bath, and everything's Anne, and then lots of Mary. We got for today.
Well, right, but I feel pretty confident at this point that what we're reading is Anne's story.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's definitely.
I thought this was going to be Elizabeth's story.
Interesting.
And then they just vanished. And as far as I can tell, the narrator could care less if any Elliot's return, before the story is over.
Well, I mean, Anne likes the Crofts. better than, I mean, towards the end, Anne has that moment where she's like, in a way, it's like this property is in better hands.
Yeah.
And the Crofts have, like, by the logic of the novel and probably by logic of today, a good marriage. I liked the argument that Mrs. Croft has with her brother, our hero, Wentworth,
right.
as much as far as we have one.
Yeah.
Where Wentworth is trying to, what does the narrator say? He's spoiled by the attention of all these women, and so he's like playing up his gallantry, and he's like, I just don't think women belong on boats. And like, not only does the sister like call him out on it, but she goes to some lengths. Like, she's like, some of the best times in my life that I ever had.
Right.
Were on a frickin' boat, and I'm not the only woman. Like, there's a lot of women that have traveled more, and like, she talks to the other older woman, Mrs. Musgrave, I guess, and she's like, I've been, to Florida, I've been all these places, and it's like, oh, okay, like I felt some feminist heat. Yeah. On that part, well, like, with the 48 or 38-year-old Mrs. Croft,
Well, yeah, and just the kind of corrective, I think that this offer, there's this kind of dual sort of response there.
Yeah.
One directly to Wentworth,
right,
who has this kind of it seems sort of put on.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what the woman says she wants. I think she deserves this, which is this kind of classic 19th century white knighting, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, speaking to that earlier complaint that Sir Walter had about sailors being like ugly and aged too early, and there's just nothing worse than a sailor,
right?
And I don't know the sort of cultural history of England as well as I might, but I'm willing to bet that here at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, your average sort of red-blooded Brit like had some strong positive feelings about its sailors.
Well, unless some wild curve is coming, all three of the captains are like, amiable fellows, right, as it were. Well, they're good guys.
And
like Hilliard, and then the I can't remember their names, Hilliard or something, and then there's like the widower
Berwick. I was just going to say, a really touching character from the start.
Yeah.
Who's done his duty. He's been sort of quietly heroic.
Yeah.
At the same time that he's been kind of really shanked by life. Yeah. Finding out that his wife has died.
Yeah, and nobody had the heart to tell him. Finally, Wentworth had to tell him. All of this is like them with Admiral Croft. Also framed positively. Right. I also enjoyed the little debate between Wentworth and Croft when Wentworth was like, oh, that boat. I don't even know which one it was.
The first one.
Yeah, he's like, that boat was on its last legs when I first got it. Right. And the older admiral's like, these captains, they don't know shit. That boat was fine.
and then Wentworth kind of comes back with like, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, like, I liked the boat, sir. And I thought about for a long time, I was like, wow, a Jane Austen novel.
Right.
With a picture of, like, the naval boats on the cover. And I was like, that is just interesting. Like, what is this action of the novel going to happen at sea? Like, I didn't really know what to expect.
Right.
And so this is a much more, whereas the other three novels, I think it was Sense and Sensibility where the girls enjoy sailors. They definitely want to go be around them.
Well, the soldiers who are billeted there are
in Bath, if I remember right.
I think so.
But here but some of those sailors weren't such good guys.
Well, these were like the lower ranking, right?
I guess
the guy that Darcy has to pay off.
Yeah. But here, so far, everything Navy. And speaking of not knowing British history, I mean, I'm intrigued by the idea of how if you didn't have rank, you could go, like, make money and get rich. Like, the whole point. I mean, the point of going to war, obviously, was to defeat France. But, I mean, like Wentworth said, Anne, when he proposed to her, there's a war. While at war, like, evidently, if you capture a boat, you just get it.
You get a piece of the prize. You get a piece of the money.
Yeah, so you, like, really are a soldier of fortune, but you're not a mercenary.
Right.
But you get rewarded. I guess you have to be, not any soldier can get this, but a captain can.
Well, I think if you're on board ship,
you get a piece.
I think, you just get a bigger piece if you're...
It adds to the incentive of, like, taking more enemy freights.
I believe.
And that's interesting to think about. And American soldiers, I mean, look, I wouldn't want to promote a culture where people were more motivated to go wreck more things. But I am kind of saying, for the British Crown, I mean, that's a little bit of like a way to provide some upward mobility to guys you're asking to fight so you can keep your shit.
Again, I don't really know this stuff very well, but I do know from some past reading that, this moment, this kind of like early to mid 1800 moment, like the sort of whole English sort of social landscape was getting rocked.
Yeah.
And it was largely because these, what had up until then been these really stable social structures that basically surrounded like landed gentry having all the capital and all the power, it just got like flipped on its head because, England had been at war for like 30 years and these sea captains, of which there were many, suddenly had real money.
Yeah.
And like the war ended and these guys just kind of like just appeared all over England.
Yeah.
And just like, how much for your house?
Yes.
And kind of like flipped a lot of things on its head.
Whereas a lot of the titled folk might have been more like Mr. Eliot, like they had to at least rent. Like they had the title, but they didn't have any money.
They had all the status, but none of this capital.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the sea captains had all this capital and not very much status.
Yes.
And
this novel is concerned with those things.
Oh, yeah.
And I like that.
Well, and the other thing that really stands out to me, I guess while we're still kind of in the kind of broader picture of it, this feels like, I hesitate to use this word because I feel like I'm not getting it quite right, but this feels like an extraordinary jump forward in maturity from the earlier novels, which is not me trying to diss the earlier novels. But
although it is unclear to me, like I know this one was published last, but like it's either this one or Northanger that evidently she wrote first. We need to figure that out. But whether or not it's chronologically a later effort, it does feel more mature.
Well, and I'll tell you why I think. And my mind might change when we finish, but for the moment, one of the things that I think is really interesting is everything we've read up until this point, I feel like has been this incredibly insightful kind of look into the mechanics of the social world, into the strategies of surviving it, into succeeding or failing, and the values or the sense or the sensibility or whatever you needed, right? But Persuasion, I think, and I will point to a certain spot where I first had this thought. Persuasion, let me find it in my notes here, is not just about surviving in this world or thriving in this world. It's about being a certain kind of person. It is a character thinking about herself in this profound way that seems to transcend her social world.
Anne's internal sort of life.
And I see it on page 45.
Okay.
When she is, as she does a lot of in today's reading, thinking about where things went wrong with Wentworth. 7 years earlier. And she's thinking about what's her name? Lady
Russell.
Lady Russell, who has talked her out of this engagement.
Back when she was like 19.
Right. Right. And she says this is the very bottom of 44 onto 45. She had given him up to oblige others. It had been the effect of over-persuasion. It had been weakness and timidity.
Yeah, and I was looking for that very passage. I'm glad you found that, because this part, too, is... It's unclear to me whether this is from Anne's point of view or if we're getting a peek at Frederick and his thinking, but I believe it's Anne understanding Frederick's point of view.
I think it's...
I think so, because
well,
later it's like he had been most warmly attached to her. Her power with him was gone forever. It was now his object to marry. Now, it does, a little bit later, share a private conversation with his aunt that I don't think that Anne got to hear, right? When he's like talking about, I want to get married. Or does she? Okay.
Well, no. Well, I think I'm thinking about the one behind the hedge.
No, this one is with Mrs.
That's later.
Croft.
Anne doesn't...
Here I am, quite ready to make a foolish match. Anybody between 15 and 30 may have me for asking. It's a funny sentence.
Yeah.
A little beauty, a few smiles. So it's like basically anybody but Anne except he also thinks that Anne is like still like the measure against when she's measuring other women. I mean, at the top of 45, this is why I think it might be Frederick's point of view also. He had been most warmly attached to her and had never seen a woman since who he thought her equal. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that, I mean, okay, maybe that's Anne hoping that, but it could be that we get a peek. I like that that's ambiguous. Mm-hmm. But that was the first use of persuasion as a word that I had caught in the novel too, wasn't it?
See, I think here on the top of 44, now, how were his sentiments to be read?
Okay.
I think this is her imagining what he thinks, which is also a way of her thinking about what she thinks.
Okay.
And I think that what we're seeing there is this kind of profound self-interrogation.
Yeah.
That I'm not trying to sort of short sell the earlier novels, but I don't know that I saw something quite so powerfully retrospective, so powerfully concerned with sort of, I don't know, what I want to call like innate character, as opposed to sort of character within the confines of the social world. And so I'm really intrigued by the sort of, 40 pages in, how just fully fleshed and complex Anne is.
Yeah, and the complexity of the characters. I mean, Lady Russell doesn't get to be just the stereotype. Mm-hmm. Oh, she's like, everybody else in Anne's family, was mean to her except Lady Russell. Well, to a point, that's true. But Lady Russell is not treated as perfect. Anne is clearly still a little bit pissed off about the way that Russell talked her into refusing Frederick. Well, and I think there's still some like resentment between them over this thing. And she's like, well, her and Frederick don't even like each other. That's going to blow up when they meet, which it kind of does not blow up, but it's uncomfortable for Anne. But
and Russell and then also her sister Mary are these kind of typical characters in a Jane Austen novel. That they're sick all the time. They need this young woman to sort of somehow be there to keep them from falling ill. Which makes me feel like, their illness is basically that they don't feel like they're being treated as important enough people, or something like that.
Right.
But they are they're sort of unlikable in this familiar feeling way. I'm thinking of I can't remember her name, but the woman who kind of was holding Frank Churchill sort of in Rain.
Jane.
His
aunt. Yes, that's right.
His
aunt.
Who
did die.
Who we argued about, like, did he really have to? Could he really not? Come to, and it seemed kind of also ambiguous. And so in some ways, this is a very familiar setup, right? We have this like not so great father. He's a different version of not so great.
Yeah.
But one is hard pressed to think of too many just great fathers.
Yeah.
In any of the Jane Austen we've seen so far.
I mean, I guess the Pride and Prejudice father is good, but he's arguably also like too indulgent, but still like mostly a good dude.
Not the worst. Yeah. But certainly not in Emma.
Yeah.
Certainly not here. I mean, Sir Walter is just. Almost the first thing I wrote down was how unbearable he was about renting Kelly Lynch.
Yeah.
Which I keep thinking of as an actress in an 80s movie.
Yeah.
Kelly Lynch, action star or something like that. But on page 14, Lady Russell, who, if I'm remembering right, basically it's her plan to get them out of debt. That he finally accepts that he has to rent the hall and move into somewhere smaller, and so we're kind of into the same situation as Sense and Sensibility, which is another reason why I thought we were going to follow Elizabeth to wherever, this cottage that they're going to stay in, this less expensive place.
Yeah.
But so Lady Russell is managing both sort of Sir Walter's reluctance and also kind of acting as real estate agent.
Yeah. Well, and then they bring the lawyer in.
Right, but she but he's being just incredibly unbearable
Yeah, he
about like what she's saying, oh, we'll get this admiral. He's going to be a great caretaker. He's going to do a really good job of keeping things well. And I thought I underlined it in the page, but I just have it in my notes here. But she's talking about how he'll his garden will have never gotten better care, and he says, I am not fond of the idea of my shrubberies always being approachable.
Yes.
He thinks he's going to like collect rent from these people and also tell them that they can't go out in the garden.
Yes.
And
that's at the bottom of 14. Okay. I mean,
there's something
he's
so...
like, supposing I were induced to let my house, I have no means made up as to the privileges to be annexed to it. I'm not particularly disposed to favor a tenant. The park would be open. So he's like imagining limitations, and the shrubberies are one of what he's calling the pleasure grounds.
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, that is going... But, it's interesting. He doesn't want to advertise it. It's important to him that someone approach him and ask so that he has, face.
Right.
And so, like, he's just basically being a baby about having to rent it at all, like...
Well... I mean, I have to admit, this is a moment where I do actually have a little bit of sympathy for him.
Sure.
Right? The only thing this guy has is a reputation.
Sure.
Right? And I mean, he literally banks on it.
Yeah.
And so, he has to be cautious here. It makes sense. What I wish were that he could be a little more upfront about it and just say, like, look, I know what has to happen here. You know what has to happen here, but we have to handle it right.
Yeah.
Instead, he's doing this roundabout, literally Lord of the Manor sort of act, so that other people have to go around him. Yeah,
like the lawyer has to tiptoe and make it all happen, but not make it happen.
Right, right, and it's like somehow if he can pretend convincingly enough that he doesn't know what's happening, it's not happening.
Right,
and there's something deeply unlikable about that.
Yeah. And the idea of selling the house is interesting too. I said, well, he would never condescend to sell it. It's like, I wonder then, like, I guess this is a little different than the entail maybe, because I don't think that the father in Sense and Sensibility would have been empowered to sell it. I think that it was like just had to pass through the... I don't know if I remember the contract right. But here, it's like, I guess he could have screwed the cousin over that he's mad at, like, because the way the narrator says it is he would never condescend to sell it, not...
Although that word operates interestingly in Jane Austen. I've noticed that there have been some interesting uses of that. And I think part of what he's saying there is he would never lower himself.
I think that's right. Which is different than he being legally bound to preserve the property for the next heir. I don't think that's the case.
And this is a familiar plot, right?
Yeah.
This is where this is almost exactly where we start with what was that big hit on HBO that opens with the sinking of the Titanic. With Lady Mary and Lord Grantham.
The Gilded Age?
No. It'll come to me, but it was just this big series that surrounded this house in the early 1900s that was going under. Right?
Yeah.
And the Lord is supposed to figure out somehow how to do this. Because the worst thing in the world would be for the family to lose this property.
That's right.
And so these guys, again, not to like act like I'm too sympathetic, because I have real limitations on my sympathy here. But the bind that they found themselves in was that they couldn't dirty themselves with business.
Right.
But they had to somehow make these properties profitable enough to sustain themselves.
I mean, there still are expenses.
Right, and this is where...
And he got into debt. Like, he borrowed money from businessmen.
Right.
So that's interesting. Like, the businessmen, whether dirty or not, are kind of dictating his decisions now.
Right, and there's this suggestion that it wasn't exactly his fault, right? That he had lordly obligations.
Yeah.
And I know this is sometimes the way that kings used to screw over nobles that they didn't like, was they'd be like, what I think would be cool is if you threw me a party. right? And then like force these people into debt.
Yeah.
And in this way that you couldn't say no, kind of Godfather style.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we're supposed to think of him as sort of irresponsible. And I do know enough of the history here to know that in some ways, the system was just unsustainable.
Yeah.
So even sort of good, stewards, good owners, just couldn't make this continue to work. As the economies changed in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But again, like as interesting as all this is, it all mostly seems to be there just in the service of getting everybody out of the way so that Anne and Wentworth can have this kind of plot happening, around Caddylands Hall.
And Elizabeth's own status as unmarried, and she's 2 years older than Anne.
Yeah.
So, that, I mean, and then the one of the problems that Mrs. Russell has is they took this widow, Mrs. Clay,
right,
with them, and she thinks that Mrs. Clay is designing to get Sir Eliot. So I'll be curious to see if that suspicion holds up. I think Anne even expressed, it was Anne who told Elizabeth, I think that Mrs. Clay might be up to something with Dad, and Elizabeth's
right.
like, no, like, plus she's got too many freckles, and
right.
I don't know what it means to have a clumsy wrist, but evidently that makes it harder to catch a man.
Yes.
So, God, she says, I myself don't mind a few freckles, but my father thinks it's an abomination. It's like, wow, that's pretty harsh.
Right.
But, so getting them out of the way as the plot device so that Anne could have this experience, definitely. I think Anne also, and again, like, this could all blow up in the second half, like, but I'm remembering Mansfield Park and how, that whole middle section where the young people had the run of the house, and they were just having fun, right, doing plays and stuff, and it never really felt like friendship. So,
right.
Fanny, the heroine of that novel, who of course we had mixed feelings about, but Fanny was never really into it. She was like there, But I thought about that sequence just before Louisa got hurt, when they were hanging out and Anne meets Wentworth's friend and then the widow,
right,
whom you like, and the friend's wife. And so you've got Louisa and Henrietta and Wentworth and the friend and the friend's wife and then the bereaved friend, and then Mr. and Mrs. Musgrave are sort of an older married couple that are jovial enough. And Anne says to herself, those could have been my friends. And I think, friendship is a very big deal in Austen, of course, in all the novels. But, like, her reasons, I think this goes back to your point, her reasons for thinking that, it's like, because they're fun and I like them. She enjoys how they are with each other.
Yeah.
She's like sad to have to consider going back to Bath now, because she's like, I'm much more interested in what happened to Louisa than I am in my own father and sister at Bath.
Right. Well, and some of this is kind of set up early on, and I keep kind of flipping back to this, that the very opening scene with Sir Walter going through, what was the book called?
The Baronetage.
The Baronetage. And just a page or two later, on page 5, we get this kind of very kind of like obvious feeling kind of discourse to just kind of like setting the tone, setting the thing, where the narrator just tells us, he's got 3 daughters. And Elizabeth has succeeded at 16 to all that was possible of her mother's rights and consequence, right? So she's socially, she's the winner. She's handsome and very, very like himself.
Yeah.
Her influence had always been great. Mary had acquired a little artificial importance by becoming Mrs. Charles Musgrove.
Right.
Which feels a little sort of backhanded.
It is.
Right? But Anne, with an elegance of mind and sweetness of character which must have placed her high with any people of real understanding, was nobody with either father or sister. Her word had no weight. Her convenience was always to give way. She was only Anne.
Yeah, I liked that passage too.
And this no weight, right? Like in a book called Persuasion, right? You know, so here she is kind of lost in the shuffle of, partly, sort of in the shadow of Elizabeth, partly just kind of written off by her father. Here she is, like, obviously important. Like, everybody needs her.
Yes, I mean it's like when that's kind of like Mansfield Park 2. They always like dismissed Fanny, but then when something were needed,
right,
they're all going to her.
Right.
And when Louisa falls and everybody's like, "What do we do?" and they just sort of look at her,
right,
and she's like, "Well, okay, we got to get a doctor. We got to do this." She's like figuring stuff out. She like yells at the widow to go help Wentworth with her, and she sort of becomes field general in the moment. And even Mary, I mean, who's pretty dismissive of her, is clearly relying on her, like you said at the beginning of the talk.
Well, Mary, in some ways,
she is better with the kids. That is clear.
Well, in some ways, I find Mary deeply unlikable.
Sure,
right? I mean, I think we're supposed to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this whole like she, Mary is always angling to be at the center of things, even when it's going to be a real problem.
Yeah.
And this is part of what happens, right? She talks her way out of having to help, like, take care of her injured kid because she doesn't want to get left out of the party.
Yeah.
In part because her husband, who's also not terribly great, is like, well, you don't need me. What would I do?
Right. And Anne kind of sides with him. She's like, well, listen, that's part of being a mother.
Right.
Like, of course he wants to leave.
Right.
And Mary's like, no. Like, if he's leaving, I'm leaving. And so it's like...
And then same thing, she doesn't want to be sent back. So, so they sent Anne, even though Anne is obviously the useful one.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to me that, we're getting this... I guess this is more of that, implied narrator, kind of, that we're getting this third-person narration, but it's obviously kind of tilted, toward kind of what Sir Walter thinks. And then later we get this implied narration, but it's obviously tilted toward what Anne thinks. And it's a neat trick in a lot of ways, but it also kind of creates this really full picture of Anne, not just in terms of her own sense of herself, but like her place in this world that is sort of both complex and at the same time a little bit like rote, like a little bit like, well, of course, right, this is how these other people are going to behave.
I would imagine there's at least some psychoanalysis approaches to this novel that deal with like the middle childness of it all, father-daughter dynamics. Because in that same passage you were talking about, Anne, her delicate features and mild dark eyes so totally different were her features from his own.
Right.
So, yeah, the sort of middle child glossed over, forgotten in all things, but expected by everyone to be there to help out. Right. People complain. A lot of people, like my father, used to complain about, oh, I was the middle child and I blah, 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 blah. It's like, oh my gosh, Dad. But... these complaints exist.
Sure.
And Anne certainly seems to be, that's a way of reading this. Mm-hmm. Speaking of the injury to the child, I thought it was interesting that in these first 90 pages, I mean, we had two
big falls, like dangerous moments, not like, oh dear, I'm sick, kind of sick. But like some shit where, in one case, the kid dislocated his collarbone. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty serious injury, and the doctor's like not sure there isn't spinal damage. Right.
Like, I don't think we entirely are even in the clear on that yet.
Right.
And then Louisa's fall. And I don't know that we're supposed to particularly love Louisa and Henrietta, but they seem mostly harmless up to this point. They're fun young women.
Yeah.
That fall pretty nasty, so I found that interesting as just pacing mechanisms. These like massive injuries,
strangely action packed. In its way. So they're out and about a lot. In this novel, I think more so than in others. I mean, I know we had that picnic in Box Hill in Emma and that kind of thing, but partly what I'm thinking about is that long walk that Mary was so hilarious about. People think that I'm not a good walker.
Yeah.
You know, but of course they're right. You know, she gets like halfway in, and you know, it's that classic. You know, the little kid who wants to go along, and even though they can't.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And then she's all snobby about visiting the brother-in-law who she thinks is beneath her.
Yes.
And all that, but they're out walking a lot. They're out in the elements a lot. They junk it to Lyme.
Pretty spontaneously.
You know, I mean, almost like the day of,
Yeah.
and then only like at the last minute are like, well, you know, we better not do that.
Yeah.
And it seems like, you know, this is an active group, and so I guess it doesn't surprise me that there are also accidents.
Yeah.
The thing about Louisa's injury, though, I'm intrigued by, like, so the classic device going all the way back to Pride and Prejudice, right, is like the ill.
Yeah.
Marianne, is it
Sense and Sensibility?
Yeah. You know, who like you know must be like nursed back to health.
Yes.
And we see versions of this, you know, in almost all the novels, and so in this way it's very familiar. But this being like a kind of kinetic injury is very different.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
As opposed to like,
Yeah.
oh dear.
Yeah, like
you know,
like some vague. Well, she got her feet wet.
Right.
Walking in the woods, like
Right.
this is like fell and hit her head.
Or just like, you know, she's heart sick or
Yeah.
something. And so one of the things that I've begun to think is there is this kind of almost cruelty, I think, in the way that scene is handled. I think the narrator wants us to not think well of Louisa here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's where is the moment? Did you find it?
I'm trying to see. It's 79, I think.
Okay.
It's a little further before the end than I thought. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, and it kind of caught me by surprise because
yeah.
they're just languidly walking around on the boardwalk, and then bam,
Right.
you know.
But there's this interesting little history built into it, right?
Yeah.
Because something that I think really stands out is this is not the first time she's done this.
She's been doing it the whole trip.
Well,
and she's did it, and then she's doing it again.
Not even the whole trip, like even before the trip, right? It says somewhere, I'm not seeing it right off.
In all their walks, he says.
Yeah.
In all their
where is
walks,
that?
they had to. This is on 79.
Okay.
It's the first paragraph. He had to jump her from the stiles.
Yes,
The sensation
yes.
was delightful to her. The hardness of the pavement for her feet made him less willing upon the present occasion.
Right.
He did it, however. So they do it once. She's safely down, and instantly, to show her enjoyment, ran up the steps to be jumped down again. He advised her against it. Thought the jar too great, but no, he reasoned and talked in vain. She smiled and said, "I am determined I will." And so then, yes, I mean, there is a one of those like, I told you, you know,
Yeah,
you're going to get hurt.
And I'm really torn how to feel about this. Because on the one hand, like, 18-year-old me wants a girl who jumps off stuff.
Sure.
Right? Like there's
It's
something
fun.
There's something lively, there's something you know, like hell yeah, let's go to let's go. There's a kind of I feel like there's a kind of richly deep kind of character here of somebody who's like you know willing to really kind of put it out there. You know, but I feel like the suggestion, almost subliminally, is that she's carried away. She's gone too far.
Yeah.
She's a victim of her own enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And in to such a degree, in fact, that she jumps too soon that second time.
Yeah.
He's gonna catch her, but she jumps before he's ready.
Yeah.
And it feels to me like there's this potential for really deep meaning, psychologically, however, psychosexually, whatever. She is literally like not at all frightened to like put her life in his hands.
Yeah.
He's the one who's like, hold up.
Yeah.
She's almost like what I think of as a teenage boy. in her willingness.
Well, I mean,
you know.
I'm reminded of that meme, and I mean, I felt this way when the boys were smaller, and I mean, it sucks, like, but I think most parents have experienced that moment where you just are telling them over and over and over again, like, man, like, it's not safe, stop doing it. And when one of them falls, and like inevitably the surprised cry, like, there's that meme. I know you don't look at social media as much as I do, but this funny meme where it's like just a picture, and it's like every parent, you know, when their kid gets hurt when they were told to stop running, and it's framed like one of those lawyer ambulance chaser billboards, and it says hurt in an accident ? And then under it, good. And that's it, right? And it's like, you know, I was reminded of that a little bit, the way the narrator sort of nudged me to think, okay, but we don't want her to die. But it's like, damn it, we told you, you know.
Right.
But I hear you, the high spirit is also desirable, and it's hard to completely dismiss out of hand.
And there's been all this kind of back channel talking about, you know, what's the Charles Hayter, the cousin,
the one that likes Henrietta.
Well, there's all this conversation about, like, does he like Henrietta?
Well, Wentworth is the one, like, so Hayter had Henrietta.
Right.
He leaves for 2 weeks.
Right, and Wentworth just blindly,
he comes back, and Henrietta,
not meaning to even start anything.
Right. So now Hayter's mad, and Hayter, like, kind of gives her up, but then Henrietta starts feeling feelings when they go down to the house.
Right.
And it looks like Henrietta's sort of like back with him now, and has given the field to Louisa for Wentworth.
And then meanwhile, you know, Lady Russell is like, perfect.
Yeah.
You know, Hayter will marry this one, Wentworth will marry that one.
Anne will be safe from Wentworth again.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so there's all this kind of back channel kind of concern about, you know, putting them together the right way and all this kind of thing. Yeah. And so I think it's really interesting that the narrator is kind of really putting Louisa out there, but also kind of holding it against her.
Yeah.
And it feels a little unfair, but it also feels sort of like in character, you know, for the book and for the time in this way. But it makes me kind of want to go back and revise my reading of some earlier things and just say, you know, this is kind of central to a lot of, especially kind of gender identity questions in Jane Austen, and it's that idea of like restraint, that idea of balancing things that Louisa literally doesn't, like that her ideal state is free fall. And you know, and I feel like there is this, maybe not her whole heart, maybe not with her whole you know unconflicted heart, but I feel like there's this sort of Jane Austen just off the margin going like, can't do that. You know, this is not the kind of world. You're not a man. You can't go off and be a sea captain.
Right.
You know, this is not you.
Yeah. So in some ways, I think this book is presenting the kind of gender questions you're talking about, for which Jane Austen was very famous during the years that we were trained. I mean, even going back to like undergrad, right? Like if you took a class and Jane Austen was being taught, it was inevitable that feminism was going to be a topic,
right?
You know, and it's been that way for long over a century, probably rightfully so. But I think this novel does it in ways that feel more modern and interesting to me. I mean, it's going to raising the question you just said, you know, about okay, maybe we're judging Louisa, maybe we're not. Of course, you know, impetuous behavior by men also can find its way to be looked down on in Austen. But again, coming back to that discussion between Mrs. Croft and Frederick when he's talking about women on the boat, like that's an interesting counterpoint, you know. So yes, you can't do that, you're not a man. I think you're making a fair point there. That's one way of looking at it, but I think another way of looking at it is the sort of, dude, it's like the modern times. Like, you can get on a boat and go places if you want. Like, you don't have to just be prim and proper all the time. Right. I mean, she's like arguing this pretty.
Yeah.
I want to find that passage because it really stood out to me. But so, I think that those. I guess what I'm saying is, I think these questions are meant. Like this part on page 50. This is in the middle of their argument. She's like, "My dear Frederick, you're talking quite idly." This is the bottom of page 50. Pray what you would become of us poor sailors' wives, who often want to be conveyed to one port or another after our husbands, if everybody had your feelings. Frederick, oh, my feelings, you see, did not prevent my taking Miss Harville and all her family to Plymouth. Then Mrs. Croft, but I hate to hear you talking so like a fine gentleman, as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures.
Right.
That's a standout sentence in the Jane Austen canon. I mean, that's just like straight up, listen, little brother, because that's what he is. Like, we none of us expect to be in smooth water all our days. Love it, And then the Admiral agrees. He's like, when he has got a wife, he will sing a different tune. When he is married, if he will have the good luck to live to another war, we shall see him as do you and I, and a great many others have done. We shall be very thankful to anybody that will bring him his wife. And so Wentworth's like, oh, whatever. That's where the argument stops. But then, like 2 paragraphs later, Mrs. Musgrove says, what a great traveler you must have been. Pretty well, ma'am, in the 15 years of my marriage, though many women have done more. That was, I thought, a great line. Many women have done more. I've crossed the Atlantic 4 times. I mean, that is in like 1814?
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun. I haven't crossed my ass over the Atlantic 4 times in the air of airplanes, and been once to the East Indies and back again, and only once, besides, lived in different places about home, Cork and Lisbon. So that's Portugal, right?
Yeah.
And Gibraltar, and I never went beyond the Straits, and we're told down there, this is Florida.
Right.
So she's been all the way to there. Yeah. So I think it's overall we're just being meant to think about the role of women. Like, yes, there's the stuff you're saying about Louisa. I think that's absolutely right. And then there's like, the schemers like Elizabeth and whatnot. But there is a place to go do stuff and be robust as a woman in this world, don't you think? Yeah.
Well, and I think a nice sort of add on to this is on page 66 when Anne is riding in the the gig?
Yeah.
I think with the Admiral and his wife, and there's this suggestion that riding with the Admiral is dangerous. That he's not great,
not a good driver,
right?
Yeah.
And there's this great moment towards the bottom of 66. The 3 of them are having this conversation. About Frederick Wentworth. Right?
Yeah, and they're talking about Louisa and Henrietta too.
Right. I wish Frederick would spread a little more canvas. And bring us home one of these young ladies.
Yeah.
Then there would always be company for them, and nice young ladies they both are. I hardly know one from the other. Right? The Admiral's just like, just pick one and go.
Yeah.
And he's sort of in the middle of this, right? Very good humor, unaffected girls, indeed, said Mrs. Croft in a tone of calmer praise, such as made Anne suspect that her keener powers might consider either of them as quite worthy of her brother.
Might not consider either of them.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the interruption. My dear Admiral, that post, we shall certainly take that post.
Yeah.
He's not watching where he's going.
Yeah.
Right. Driving the thing.
Yeah.
But by coolly giving the reins a better direction herself.
Yeah.
They happily passed the danger, and by once afterwards judiciously putting out her hand, they neither fell into a rut nor ran afoul of a dung cart.
Love it.
And Anne, with some amusement at their style of driving, which she imagined no bad representation of the general guidance of their affairs, found herself safely deposited by them at the cottage.
She likes how they roll. Like it says right here, some amusement at their style of driving.
And the sort of obvious sort of metaphor here, right, is that this is their marriage, this is their life.
Yeah.
That like he's out there kind of doing his thing, but it's not like unforgivable or even undesirable for her to occasionally stick a hand in and be like, whoa.
Yeah.
And that they understand that this is a partnership.
Yes.
In this way that is very different from what Wentworth is suggesting in that earlier section that you were just reading from.
Yeah.
That what she thinks and wants and cares is like really part of the discussion.
Yeah.
And there isn't room for this whole like gentlemanly like, well, you may think that, but my sentiments don't allow for that. The admiral is kind of like too cool for that. In the positive sense, he's literally too cool to just ignore what a woman says she wants.
Yeah, he's like, well, come on then.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Let's
go to Portugal.
Right.
Yeah.
But then again, in the context of Lisa's leap, this feels like, like
it comes with risks.
Well, and the narrator is, I think, kind of playing both sides here a little bit, maybe unfairly so.
Yeah.
Saying like she shouldn't have wanted that.
Well, I mean, how much could we say, given the emphasis on the Navy stuff that we talked about at the beginning, the emphasis on everything you said about Louisa and what we're saying about Mrs. Croft? I mean, how much is this novel maybe about risk? I mean, Anne, I think, is living in a constant state of regret that she had the one chance herself to take a big risk and was talked out of it, by her sister, her father, and Mrs. Russell. And this is the great lament in her heart. Like, it's been, she even says, a third of my life, it's been 8 years, and I still can't get over this motherfucker. She's even been proposed to by the guy that wound up marrying her sister.
Yeah.
So it's not like she hadn't had her shots.
And the way that the novel, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
The way that the novel holds that in its pocket and then goes, oh, by the way.
Yes.
And like hits you with it like 40 pages in.
Yeah.
That is wonderful. That is really, like, I remember having to kind of like.
Yeah. Well, and, this business about her looks confuses me, and maybe you can help me with this. Like, I think this might be like, okay, she used to be pretty, then like the bloom died fast. Like, evidently by the time she's 25, she's already not pretty, and Frederick's gone, and now by the time she's 27, she's supposedly out here looking like Aunt Maud.
Right.
Okay. Then, because she went out to Lyme and she's been hanging with them, everybody's like, damn, she's looking good. What is going on there? I mean, that too could be risk. It's like, well, you're looking better because you're doing stuff, girl. Like, I don't know what to make of this beauty scale.
I think partly what you're saying makes a lot of sense, that she's out in the world doing things, and it changes the way people see her. It maybe also literally changes how she looks.
The color in her sheets.
She's not sad sacking around.
Yeah.
But I think there's also this aspect of that initial judgment that I think we're maybe being overly persuaded by Lady Russell's,
or even Anne's estimation of herself.
But this kind of brings me to kind of like maybe a kind of place to begin wrapping up as well. Is I've been thinking a lot about the title of this. It feels different, from all the other titles.
Very.
I feel like there was this very like clear moment, on page whatever, talking about her regrets and her sense of over persuasion, or her fear that Wentworth thought of it as
that she had been over persuaded.
That being persuadable is this bad thing, but then there's also that other meaning of persuasion, which is kind of like that state of being, or the you can say of a certain persuasion. And I think,
what you like, you mean, that kind of
I mean, like, we're both of a generation that you probably heard like people like 10 or 15 years older than you using that as a euphemism for gay.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
That, of a certain persuasion. Of a certain sensibility, of a certain identity, I guess. And so I think one of the things we're trying to figure out, right, is that balance between like, so what is Anne's persuasion, along with how persuadable is Anne, and how. And what role does persuasion in both of those meanings play in how things work out, right? Like, Anne is very much of the opinion that she's where she is in part because other people kind of persuaded things, they kind of massaged things that way. And I think she's owning her part in it, but she's also kind of thinking about that. But I think at the same time, there are these kind of innate characteristics, that she is expressing. Innate's maybe a strong word, but she has she has a certain persuasion, right? And I think I want to think, partly just because I like her, that this lively seaside version is actually who she is when she's free of that overbearing persuasion.
Yeah, like when given an opportunity to be herself.
Yeah.
I mean, like she would be someone who would be out doing stuff. I mean,
Right.
she still has this, like, somewhat cloying moral center sort of vibe. I mean, like I too liked Berwick. Is it Berwick?
Yeah, the widower.
But she's like, I don't know, man, like lecturing him about books to read and stuff, and he appreciated it, so I guess it's fine. But I'm like, oh, here we go again. This is
Benwick,
like Fanny. Benwick, yeah. It's like, this is like Fanny from Mansfield Park. Like, oh, everybody loves the young woman that's going around telling you how you should live. That's always a fun girl to be around, you know.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of that.
Right.
That she still hangs on to, even Seaside, but you get the impression it's not like Fanny where it's like the overriding everything. Right. Like she still is like liking stuff, and
I think she's supposed to represent this kind of attractive middle ground.
Yeah.
Right. She's not going to just like leap off stairs and expect you to catch her.
Right.
But she's also not going to just like sit in a parlor and act sick and talk about coats of arms and being a baronetess.
That's right.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
In that way. I do feel like before we wrap up, we should talk about this godson, who we encounter.
The cousin.
Or is that what he is? The heir, whoever.
Yeah. I think he's a cousin of. He's like related to them, definitely. Like he's the next male heir.
Yeah.
His name is Elliot. And he was checking her out.
Yeah. Where is that?
It was before the injury.
Yeah. So it must be around 60-something.
Yeah. I mean, it's on 76 when it's revealed who he was.
Okay. So.
But it's over on page...
Here it is, 75.
75,
when
when
they
the
came to
dude...
the steps leading up from the beach, a gentleman at that same moment, preparing to come down, politely drew back and stopped to give them way. They ascended and passed him, and as they passed, Anne's face caught his eye, and he looked at her with a degree of earnest admiration, which is almost pornographic in a Jane Austen novel, which she could not be insensible of. Yeah. He was looking remarkably...
Yeah, this is the part I was thinking of.
She was looking remarkably well, her very regular, very pretty features having the bloom and freshness of youth restored by the fine wind which had been blowing on her complexion. There had been that whole talk about the health of the seaside.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I will just say, I like to think of myself as like pretty rational about these things, but I, too, just feel healthier after a weekend at the beach. There's something about like the sand and the salt.
Interesting.
I just feel like it just kind of scrubs your soul a little bit.
The novel obviously likes the sea. I mean, because she was also, like the narrator says, there's that one really little part where it's like when they're walking early in the morning and they have to stop and gaze at the sea.
Yes.
And the narrator says something like, anybody, that deserved to even go to the sea in the first place would have to have such a lingering or something. I don't know where that is. That's somewhere.
It's a little earlier than this, I think.
Yeah, but yes, I agree with you that it is certainly more than a trope. It's too many people have testified too often to their feelings about the ocean in that way. But also... Again, like with the captains and with all the talk about the Navy, and like you said, probably the deep appreciation of the Navy among British citizens in the 1810s, the sea is going to be thought of with some frickin' reverence. That is for sure.
And I should say, just in kind of context, part of this is, as you know, I'm working on this project connected to the RAF in the 19-teens. I guess almost exactly 100 years after this.
Yeah.
And what I saw in this project was this almost reverence to the degree to which ordinary Londoners, appreciated the risk that RAF pilots were taking in World War One. I know from other things I've read and seen that there's a similar sort of feeling for all of the soldiers in World War II. And so I can't help but think that, along with, the kind of just general kind of jingoism and nationalism that everybody gets caught up in to some degree or another in times of war, that there must have been this sense that the Navy was kind of like the thing saving them. And so, add to that this kind of almost inescapable romance of like the ocean.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a tangent, but as you know, I really pay a lot of attention to that kind of late 1800s stuff in American lit. And I was really struck, especially with the introduction of Benwick. I was really struck at this similarity that I had not thought about with Jane Austen before, and Sarah Orne Jewett, who has these kind of incredible portraits, like in Country of the Pointed Firs, these incredible portraits of these old sea captains who have stopped going to sea, but still have their sort of ways. Up in that sort of, I forget the name of the town in Maine where the stories all happen, and just this kind of sense of the kind of magic that these people just sort of like carry around inside them because they've had this exposure to the sea, and and it's built a certain character. It's made them people of a certain persuasion.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So
I look forward to seeing it. Well, because evidently, if we do, the plan was for Anne to go to Bath, and so she still might
and we
do
know
that.
She's on like a 2-week countdown at the point of our
and isn't that
here.
That's Oceanside also? It's kind of hard to not be Oceanside in England. It is on an island.
Yeah, and it seems like they're a pretty quick ride away.
Yeah.
If they want to be.
Yeah.
But yeah, Bath puts her at least closer to the ocean, if not at the ocean.
So either way, we're probably going to see more.
I do not to
water.
Not to be overly critical of Patricia Meyer-Spax here, but I have to say I miss the map. I want a map.
Yeah.
In my Norton Critical Edition,
so that when they start talking about this shire and that shire, you can like go back and be like, which way they going?
I miss if I'm ever in a position to do any kind of Norton Critical Edition, I think the first thing I'm going to say is like, if you're not going to let me put a map in the inside cover, I'm not your guy.
Yeah. Especially for a book that has so much traveling.
Yeah, and what's interesting is,
of course, you're making this for readers. Like at the time it was written, they didn't need a map because it was for British readers, and they all knew where all this shit was.
Right.
But now it's a global sensation. That's why you're making a Norton edition anyway.
And even if you kind of know where it is, I think there's something powerful about being able to flip back to something and go, oh, from there to there on a map.
I like it. I like it too.
And they're not going far.
Yeah.
I mean, I get the sense that nobody, within the confines of this story, nobody's traveled more than about 20 miles. But
she's not very invasive with the notes either compared to some of the other editors.
It's true.
I will look forward to, and maybe even we should say, since we only have one more reading proper, I guess what we'll do is, for part 2 of this, we'll just finish the novel. And then we'll probably have like the one more thing where we talk about context. But I think I propose, if you'd be down with it, adding her. Well, I will. Well, I was going to say adding her introduction, but it's really just a preface. But so adding the preface, and also I would remind you that there's the original ending of Persuasion.
I was assuming that we would read both
endings. We do need to read that. Yeah. And I'm sure the preface is going to talk about that.
Yeah, I would like to. I certainly don't mind adding the preface.
Yeah.
And I would like to just basically read from 91 to 188.
Okay.
Which takes us all up to the background.
Yeah. Let's do that
for next time. It's almost exactly the same length.
It'd be like 98 pages plus the preface.
Yeah, which is
we're also talking about probably a 3-week break before we can do it again.
And the preface is 11 pages. Yeah. So you're right. I hadn't thought about, but Spax is she's a little bit more behind the scenes than some of our other editors, and I can't say that I've had moments where I've really missed the notes.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing to think about. You know, what gets notes and what doesn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's do that
Okay.
next time, and then we'll have a third to look at the background.
To look at the background, and then we'd be finished with Persuasion.
Sounds great.
All right.